Hey folks, Matt Eason here, Scholar Gladiatorian. Now, I want to talk about a little point that I'll try and keep as concise as possible, which is about how we score hits, should we say, in HEMA, but this could be applicable to any martial arts, but particularly it's applicable to where we're dealing with dissimilar weapons, okay? So, one of the problems that this stems from, and one of the reasons that I'm making this video, is I have some degree of issue as someone who runs tournaments and competes in tournaments, or has competed in tournaments for many years, but someone who runs tournaments and organises, you know, the rules and everything else for tournaments, is rapiers. Now, rapiers are somewhat problematic from my point of view as a tournament organiser, because essentially the parameters of a rapier are so diverse. Okay, as I've spoken about in many different videos, rapiers can come in many different forms. Some are really long, and some are just medium long. Some have a reasonable degree of cutting capacity, and some historical rapiers have very little cutting capacity at all. At either end of the spectrum, we, for example, find things like this. The rapier that I use, it's 1,300 grams. It's about a 42-43 inch blade. It's modelled on one in the Wallace collection. It's a big sword, and when you cut with this type of sword, it has a lot of force behind it. Now, it's not the broadest blade in the world. It's not as broad as a sabre or an arming sword or a back sword, or obviously a long sword or something like that. But that being said, a chop, be it given just directly or with some kind of moulinet, okay, or some type of circular movement, does have quite a lot of force. And any of my club mates will tell you that this can hit pretty damn hard. And equally, I've been hit by other people's rapiers that can hit pretty damn hard. But just hitting hard doesn't necessarily equate to good cutting, and some people out there will take sharp rapiers and cut through water bottles and go, look, they can cut. And yeah, a fast moving sword will, generally speaking, as long as it's sharp, cut through a water bottle. But if we take for example a pig carcass, then you'll notice that slower moving, broader bladed, more tip present swords will outperform massively. So if we take something like a falchion or a Viking era sword, or just any kind of broad bladed sword, a sabre, even cavalry sabre, something like a 1796, it will perform much better on cutting actual targets that are like a body than something like a rapier will, for a number of reasons. But I don't want it to be taken, because some people have misunderstood what I've said in the past and said that Matt Eason says rapiers can't cut. Rapiers can cut, at least if they're the right type of rapier. Some rapiers, I would assert, cannot cut. They can give a blow, but they cannot cut. There are examples in the Wallace collection, for example, or any other major museum which has got a bunch of rapiers, which are in the cutting portion of the blade, so up here, the bit you'd be hitting someone with, they are essentially square in cross-section. So yes, you could hit someone with one, but because of the cross-section of the blade, because they're so narrow, they're not going to cut, they will just hit. So, how does that relate to what I initially talked about? Well, the problem is that in rapier competitions and rapier tournaments, you get all different types of blades. Now, I have made this assertion online in the past, but it's my opinion that if you want to skew the odds in your favour in most modern rapier tournaments, then you use the longest blade you can manage. That is also the lightest blade you can manage. So the longest, lightest blade, regardless of what its actual properties would be in real life, TM. So for example, you could have a cup hilt, because cup hilts are very protective, have a cup hilt to protect your hand, and then you have a really long, say 45, maybe even longer, maybe 47 inch blade, that's really narrow but really stiff, somewhat like an épée, okay? Now, the problem with that is that, yes, that will give you the maximum reach. It'll also mean it's quick, so you can bash people with it, and you can score points by tapping them with some bit of your blade. Certainly the thrusts any type of, it doesn't really matter whether it's a wide blade or a narrow blade, a thrust is going to have the same effect in real life. But with the cuts, that's where the real problem lies, because if someone's using what used to be known as a military rapier, okay, in some books, if someone's using a heavy military rapier that in real life would be able to give decent cuts, the problem is they're now going to be at a disadvantage in the tournament scene because their weapon is slower and more cumbersome. Because, surprise, surprise, the type of rapier that can give good cuts is usually a little bit more mass at the tip, a little bit broader, different type of edge geometry, different type of blade, basically. And they are disadvantaged at when it comes to giving quick little, taps with the blade that in reality wouldn't be able to cut. So if we take as an extreme example, if I just grab the foil here. So I've made this point previously in regards to a Game of Thrones critique video I did where Arya is fighting against Brienne in a kind of I would say training fight, but it's more like a friendly duel really. And Arya is constantly hitting Brienne with her, what's essentially a foil, or more like an épée, really. And what does that represent? Well, as I made the point in that video, that doesn't really represent anything, because Brienne is using a large, slow, heavy sword that if she were to cut with it, would actually cut. Whereas Arya, yes, I know we see her cut with it and this kind of stuff, but that's Hollywood science. In reality, the sword she's using wouldn't be able to cut into Brienne's body and wouldn't be able to cut through clothes because the blade's too narrow and the edge geometry is all wrong. Okay, so the fact is that yes, I can pick up a foil and fight someone who's using, let's say, a basket-hilted Highland broadsword, and I can really quickly tap, 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 I can knock them all over the place because I've got a weapon which is stupidly light and quick. But it's only stupidly light and quick because it's of a blade type that could never possibly cut. So simulating cuts on a person, oh look, I can hit you everywhere with it because I'm really, really quick at moving this foil around. Well, of course, because it's a foil. And the problem is if you extrapolate this to rapier tournaments, you get people using a type of rapier which is really optimized for tournament fighting with a very long, very light, very narrow, but also stiff blade, and it gives them an unfair advantage, especially, well, really, I'm talking about cuts here, because they can land a cut more easily than they would be able to do if they were using a type of rapier that could actually realistically land effective cuts. Now, you can extrapolate that too, as I mentioned at the beginning, when you introduce mismatched weapons. So say, for example, we have a tournament that allows rapiers and sabres. Now, the rapier has an advantage of reach, obviously. It also has some other advantages as well. I'd go as far as to say, in a one-on-one fight, the rapier has the basic advantage over the sabre. In a melee and general skirmishing, that might not be the case, but in a one-on-one fight, I would say the rapier has the advantage. But if we're purely assigning points to hits here, well, a thrust from either of these weapons should be worth about the same amount of points, because at the end of the day, it's a sharp point of a similar cross-section and size entering a person's body. So that's the same. But should a cut from a rapier be the same points as a cut from a sabre, or to make it even more exaggerated, something like a Highland broadsword, or an arming sword, or a side sword, or a falchion even, or a longsword? And I don't think it should. Because it goes back to this point that if you've got the weapon which is optimized for one thing, and therefore worse at something else. So a rapier can cut, but it's not as good at cutting as an arming sword or a falchion is. Clearly, that's why those other swords existed. That's why in the time of the rapier, people still used things like storters and backswords and broadswords and stuff like this. If there are swords which are better at cutting, then surely if we're having a tournament where these two things get to fight each other, then the weapon which is better at cutting should score more points for a cut. And I think that's very much the case. And we have run a tournament like this, probably probably a couple of years ago now, where essentially we gave different point scores for blows from hits from different weapons. So for example, a cut from a sabre or a backsword scored more points than a cut from a rapier, but equally we divided the rapiers into categories. We had cut and thrust rapiers like this, fairly heavy with quite a lot of authority in the tip, giving a certain amount of points for a cut, and then the lighter the lighter at the tip, more nimble and narrower rapiers, we gave less points for a cut. And then a small sword, I know this is a foil, it's not a small sword, but it's what I have to hand. A small sword, you could hit with it, but it scored, in these rules that we did, it scored no points with a cut at all, nil point. Quite simply because we were simulating triangular bladed late period small swords, which don't really have edges. So you can hit someone with it, but it's not going to do much, other than sting slightly. So there we go. I hope that I understand some people will take something that I've said there in the wrong way and get their knickers in a twist and get all uppity about it. I do agree, most probably rapiers can cut to some degree, but not all rapiers can cut to the same degree. Some rapiers are far more choppy than others. Some rapiers, I would argue, cannot cut at all. Some small swords can cut a little bit, but most small swords can't really cut, not much, well, hardly at all. And I do believe that within comparing different types of sword, we should be looking at attributing a greater number of points for cuts from some swords compared to other swords. And by extrapolation, I think that rapier tournaments should be more critical of what points they award different types of rapiers. Otherwise, all we're going to see is more and more and more rapiers optimized for tournament, which don't pay due regard to the differences of different types of rapiers that were actually used in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the different attributes that those different types of blade and hilt can give. And so we're going to lose some of those historical subtleties and differences and just reinvent an épée, basically. Because currently, in most rapier rules, the optimum thing to use would be a giant épée. And I do believe that's why we see so many cup-hilted, very long, narrow-bladed rapiers being used, because they're like a giant épée. And if you get the same points for hitting with one of those, then that's what people are going to use. Anyway, I hope that's been perhaps thought-provoking to some people. I hope it's not been too annoying to those of you who will inherently disagree with this point of view, which I know you are out there. But anyway, something maybe to talk about. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.